modern world of global community, what they call the global community, where everybody cares about everybody else and nobody steals from anybody else's wealth or property. I mean, I'll give you an example of dhimmatu. In the Gulf War I, right, the United States protected Kuwait, and it was a good thing because Kuwait was unjustly, but it wasn't for free. It cost a lot of money, really, like several hundred, tens of billions of dollars. So it costed a lot of money, and the Kuwaiti government paid quite dearly for that protection. So things aren't free. Protection's not free. I mean, that's just the way the world works. So you can call it paying for our weapons or whatever you want to call it, but in Islam it's just dhimma means responsibility. It's much cheaper than America charges for protection. I guarantee you, it's a much better deal that they would also enter into that covenant to be protected. And the Prophet said, "Man adali dhimmiyan fa ana khasmuhu yawm al-qiyamah." Whoever harms a dhimmi, a Jew, a Christian, or anybody else in a covenant with the Muslims, whoever harms them, I will be the advocate of that dhimmi on the day of judgment. The Prophet will be the advocate of that dhimmi. Now, one of the fantasies that many Muslims have about Muslim history is that when the Muslims came, everybody just said, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, we're Muslims. That's the fantasy that Muslims have. In fact, Imam Zayd once remarked that when you read Islamic history, you have to take a double dose of Iman vitamins, because it can be actually quite disturbing to see some of the things that occurred in Muslim history. Now, according to Dr. Khalid Blankenship, who I regard as probably one of the greatest living historians, that's my own personal opinion, but he's the Ibn Khaldun of his time. Dr. Khalid Blankenship said that in Egypt, it took 300 years before the Muslims reached 50% of the population. In Syria, it took 500 years. So during all of that early period, the majority of people in those countries were not Muslims. And if you read in the history, and just one example of this, because it's very important in relation to Andalusia. One example of this is the extraordinary scholar Tajuddin as-Subki, who wrote a really beautiful book, Mu'id al-Ni'am wa Mubid al-Niqam, how to maintain blessings and how to avoid calamities. In that book, he mentions that he wished the Muslims would leave all their disputations and arguing amongst each other and reach out to all of the non-Muslims in the community. He said, we use these people, nastaghilluhum. I mean, he's living in the 8th century. Nastaghilluhum, he said, we exploit them. Nastatibbuhum, we go to them for medicine. And he said, wa nastakhdimuhum, nattakhiduhum khadama, we take them as servants, but we don't teach them what Islam is. We don't tell them about Islam. So he was complaining at that time, and he mentions that they were all over. There were so many of them. So as late as that, there were many, many non-Muslims. But over the years and over the centuries, many of these people ended up becoming Muslim. But we are still, and I'm proud of the fact that there are several million Coptic Christians in Egypt. Really, I think it's a source of pride. It's not a source of failure for the Muslims. It's a source of pride that their churches were protected in a time when the Europeans were literally banishing from their land anything that had to do not only with other religions, but with Christian doctrines that did not accord with their own. So the Catholics were expelling Unitarians. And when the Protestants emerged, the Catholics persecuted them mercilessly. Many of the great Protestants, actually, who were in Eastern Europe, ended up moving to the Ottoman lands because the Ottomans didn't care if they were Protestant or Catholic. They just said, you're welcome to come. And they let them come. So it's very important to see that as a source of pride, that the Muslims defended their minorities. And I'll give you one example of the martyrs of Cordoba, who were a very interesting group of Christians. These were really fanatical Christians who were very disturbed by the numbers of Christians that were converting to Islam from the Visigoths. The martyrs of Qurtuba would go into the mosques and they would curse the Prophet ﷺ openly because they wanted to be martyred. So they were doing it to revive the spirit. And this is something any beleaguered religious community will often resort to, a type of stupid martyrdom, a really useless martyrdom, as a way of trying to keep a resistance alive. Do you see? It's a religious phenomenon that you see throughout religious history. So this is what they did. Because the rulers at that time realized what they were doing, they would go to extraordinary ends to prevent them from being punished. And they would protect them and do this. It's a very interesting, although some were killed, and Muslims would get very angry. I mean, Muslims, if you do something like that to a Muslim, they'll literally go insane and could kill a person just because it's a type of temporary insanity, because they're so enraged that somebody could desecrate or degrade any of the prophets, but certainly the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So during this period, Shabrut